sitting on my doorstep, the people's passing by. They're coming back from getting wrecked. Everybody's high. Saturday night, what a bitch, laying on the lawn. The morning comes to bring the switch after the buzz is gone.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Addictions, the podcast about addictions. I'm your host, David Wagner. On this episode of Addictions, we are going to be discussing some recent news developments regarding addiction. First off, we're going to be talking about a recent study from the University of Montreal, which shows that smoking cannabis, marijuana, weed, grass, dope, whatever the kids are calling it these days, but this study showed that smoking pot at a younger age generally can translate to a higher risk of drug abuse at a later age. Then we will be moving on to talk about the World Health Organization, or the WHO, and its recent decision to add video game addiction to the Medical Diagnostic Guide, also known as the ICD. After that, we are going to be talking about the state of New York and its plans to allow medical marijuana as an alternative to opioids. And finally, last but not least, we are going to touch on the subject of cheese. Yes, you heard right. Cheese. And whether or not it has addictive properties. Some of you may have heard about this or maybe not, but I've seen it all over the internet in the past few years. So yeah, you're not going to want to miss that, so stay tuned. Alright, before we dive right in, I just want to remind everyone that as always, you can catch up with all of the news and updates to the Addictions Podcast by following us on Facebook at facebook.com/addictionspodcast. You can also find us on Twitter. Our handle is @addictionscast or twitter.com/addictionscast. You can also go to our website, which is www.addictionspodcast.com. From there, you can find all sorts of helpful resources for dealing with addiction and find links to listen to the show on any of the major podcast platforms, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, and many more. And if you really love the show and want to toss us your spare change, you can visit addictionspodcast.com/donate now to learn more. We accept donations of any size through PayPal, and alternatively, you can also donate on a monthly basis through our Patreon page. Now, if you choose the Patreon route, you will actually gain access to all sorts of extra bonus audio and video content for as little as $1 a month. You can find out more about that by visiting www.patreon.com/addictions. Again, that's patreon.com/addictions. And as always, I want to thank everyone for listening and all of you who have already chose to donate to the show. Every single dime makes a huge difference. I loved making the Addictions Podcast, but it is a time-consuming and somewhat costly process. So any sort of donations are hugely appreciated. But enough of my BS. Let's get right into it. Okay, our first addictions news topic comes from a recent study conducted at the University of Montreal in Canada. This study was actually released back in May of 2018, and the study shows a pretty solid link between smoking pot at a younger age and having an increased risk of drug use or abuse later on in life. The study pretty much shows that those who start using marijuana at the beginning of their teen years, we're talking 13 to 14 years of age, the risk of having a drug abuse problem by the age of 25 is roughly 68%, which is a pretty large percentage. The study actually goes on to say that if you waited even just a couple of years, say like the age of 15 to 16, to start using marijuana, that the risk actually drops down to 44%, which is huge. That's a major drop in the chances that you're going to develop a drug abuse problem later on in life. Now, it should be noted that this study, for some reason, only focused on males and not females, and I'm really not exactly sure why. But anyways, the researchers at the University of Montreal looked at data from 1,030 different boys from the 1980s through 2006. I believe the early 1980s. So it was a really long, drawn-out kind of study. Anyways, each year between the ages of 13 and 17, the boys were asked if they had used or consumed marijuana at all in the previous year. Once the boys reached the age of 17, they were also asked if they had used any other drugs besides marijuana in the previous year. The same question was asked again at the age of 20, and then again at the age of 28. The results of the study confirmed what a lot of people would probably guess. The younger that a person starts using pot or marijuana, the more likely they would develop a drug abuse problem or even an addiction later on in life. Pretty much the research kind of seems to show that in some cases marijuana can indeed be a so-called gateway drug. Now, one thing that the study kind of failed to show is the exact reason for this. And I have many questions about this myself. Were the boys exposed to other drugs because they were buying their weed on the black market? My guess is that this is exactly the case, due to the fact that up until about the last decade or so, marijuana has been 100% illegal. And personally, I have been exposed myself to the option of buying other drugs besides just marijuana from my regular pot dealer. I would go over there and I would buy a quarter ounce of weed or whatever, and more often than not, my dealer would have other things that he was also selling. You're picking up some weed, David. Here, do you want some of this cocaine, or do you want to try some of these mushrooms? That kind of thing. But that's really the main reason that I see marijuana as a gateway drug. It's basically the only reason that I see marijuana as a gateway drug, is because, at least back in the day when you went to buy pot from someone, it was quite likely that they might have other substances for sale as well. But I would love to hear anyone else's thoughts on this study, so if anybody has any questions or comments about this, feel free to shoot us a message on Facebook at facebook.com/addictionspodcast, or you can email me at theaddictionspodcast@gmail.com. Moving on to our next addictions news topic, we're going to talk about the World Health Organization and its recent recognition of video game addiction as a real disorder. The World Health Organization, or WHO for short, maintains a database of internationally recognized disorders and diseases called the ICD, which is short for the International Classification of Diseases. Healthcare professionals around the planet use the codes and definitions in the ICD as a basic foundation to discuss all sorts of illnesses and diseases. It's really quite similar to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, that psychologists use as a handbook to identify and talk about mental disorders. Both of these manuals are updated on a semi-regular basis as we learn more and more about diseases and mental disorders over the years. Anyways, the WHO recently added video game or gaming addiction to the 11th edition of the ICD. And if you remember, I did an episode a while back titled Digital Heroin, where we talked about not only video game addiction, but also social media addiction and other technology-related addictions. If you missed that episode, you can go back and find it on addictionspodcast.com or on the RSS feed for the show in your favorite podcast listening app. Anyways, according to the official statement by the WHO, gaming addiction was added to the ICD-11 due to the fact that numerous treatment programs and facilities for teens and adults alike struggling with gaming addictions have sprung up around the globe. Basically, it's becoming so prevalent that it can no longer be ignored or discounted. Symptoms of gaming addiction include having no control over impulses to play video games, increased time spent playing video games without regard to the consequences, and prioritizing video games over other more important responsibilities or other activities. In order to be diagnosed with a video game addiction, one must show significant impairment in personal life, social life, one's occupation or job, or a person's family life. Now, in the past, there have been extreme cases of gaming addiction where parents who have the addiction actually ignored responsibilities to their own children. And in some cases, this even led to the death of a child. Basically, these people were so wrapped up in their addictions that they did not feed their very young kids, tragically causing the death of a child due to malnourishment. The WHO is hoping that this addition of gaming addiction to the ICD-11 will help countries create public health programs to effectively combat this addiction. Now, I personally think that this is really a long time coming, and that as technology kind of continues to become a more and more crucial part of society, that we are probably going to see continued increases in the rate of this addiction, affecting more and more people. So it's definitely something that we're going to have to address. Our next topic is the recent news about the Department of Health in the state of New York and its decision to allow adults to use medical marijuana as an alternative to opioid medications. According to the story from the newspaper U.S. News, the state commissioner in New York announced that the Department of Health will begin working on regulations which are going to allow adults who have been prescribed opioids or who have even been addicted to opioids to use medical marijuana in place of those opioids. The commissioner also stated that using medical marijuana in place of opioids is actually backed by research that shows that having access to medical marijuana actually reduces opioid use and abuse, and thus lowers the risk of opioid overdose death, along with a lower risk of addiction. The commissioner, Howard Zucker, also stated that, quote, "We looked at the pros, we looked at the cons, and when we were done, we realized that the pros outweighed the cons." End quote. Zucker also said that researchers had surveyed a large array of issues, including age, production, and distribution, and decided that the legalization of medical marijuana in New York State was a viable option. So far, these new regulations have been really quite strict. Basically, it limits the marijuana use to edibles. You can't smoke it. But as time goes on, they are probably going to become more and more lax. And finally, last but not least, we are going to talk about cheese. Over the past 10 years or so, I've seen quite a few articles and studies popping up online which state that cheese actually contains opioid peptides called casomorphins. Now, the word casomorphin it's spelled C-A-S-O, not Q-U-E-S-O like the Spanish word for cheese. But anyways, studies suggest that these casomorphins can be quite addicting. But don't worry, cheese is probably not going to become a Schedule II substance or anything like that. Back in 2015, there were a lot of headlines stating things like, "Say cheese all the time, maybe you have an addiction," and similar things to that. Of course, the media kind of took this and sort of ran with it without doing a lot of research on the subject. And while it is true that cheese does contain these types of opioid peptides, actual research has shown time and time again that just because a food may activate the brain's reward system via these opioid-like peptides, this by no means makes the food addictive. I'm not saying that food can't become an addiction, because there are many people all over the world that struggle with eating disorders and addictions to food. But in reality, as far as the cheese thing goes, it's far more likely that the high levels of sugar and fat contained in processed foods like cheese products are probably the reason that people develop food-based addictions. So the next time you're reaching for the cheddar, I wouldn't worry about becoming physically dependent. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Addictions. As always, I want to thank you all for listening to the show. Again, be sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and you can find the show just by searching for Addictions Podcast on either of those platforms. And if you have any questions or comments, or if you'd like to be a guest on an upcoming episode of the show and share your story, feel free to email me at theaddictionspodcast@gmail.com, and I'll do my best to work something out. And as always, never quit quitting.
You spent your money freely, then you smashed your only car. You aren't what you are really, you missed it by so damn far. Your head feels like it's in a blender, and you hate to see the dawn. Your stomach says return to sender after the buzz is gone. Your Sundays you prayed Uncle John, you poisoned yourself last night. Mary slapped your friend Tom, you got in a hell of a fight. Monday comes and it's back to work, the week seems so damn long. The weekend's past, you're still a jerk after